I'm going to illustrate this to you from the scriptures today. I'm going to actually be jumping through several different scriptures, and we're going to look at multiple places where it not only prophesies of the Gentiles being grafted in, but also provides examples of it. And we're also going to look at how the split happened and what it means for the relationship between the church and Israel, because there's actually an example of it in Israel's history. So let me grab that real quick. So, let's start with Torah. I've been here before. I've talked about Genesis. You have the story of Joseph and his brothers, right? And Joseph's brothers didn't like the little brat. Why didn't they like him? Well, number one, he was Jacob's favorite son and had the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat to prove it. Number two, he kept having dreams that he was going to rule over them, that they were going to bow down to him. Well, he's the fourth from youngest son. They don't think he's ever going to be able to rule over the rest of them. It's supposed to go to the oldest son that gets that role. That would be Reuben. And then finally, he gives a bad report. As a matter of fact, he gives a bad report about them goofing off when they were supposed to be herding the sheep. And then Jacob sends him out and says, okay, go check up on your brothers. This time bring me a good report. He's trying to smooth things over between them. But when Joseph finally catches up with his brothers, they're not where they're supposed to be. They're in Dothan, which is the local equivalent of Las Vegas. What happens in Dothan stays in Dothan, right? But not if Joseph shows up and takes back another bad report to Dad. As at that point, the brothers start talking. It's like, all right, that's enough of this. We're going to get rid of him. Let's get rid of the little snot. So they take him, they throw him into a pit. And you guys know the story. Now, interestingly enough, Yeshua was hated for the same reason. And for those who are not used to my Hebraisms, Yeshua is just Hebrew for Jesus. There's nothing wrong with saying Jesus, just like there was nothing wrong with the apostles writing his name as Jesus in the Greek. I just happen to say Yeshua because it happens to be his original name. It also happens to have some wordplay in the traditional Jewish liturgy. I'll have to get into that another time. But Yeshua was hated by the leaders of Israel for the same reason. Number one, he was the favorite son of Israel. They were jealous of his popularity. And he was also the favorite son of the Father and had the gifts to prove it in the miracles he did. Number two, he was prophesied to rule over them, and they didn't think this hick from Galilee had the right. And number three, on two different occasions, he caught them in their sin and exposed it. The first is recorded in John's Gospel. I believe it's chapter 2, when he goes and clears out the temple for the first time. The other three gospel accounts, it talks about him going and clearing out a second time near the end of his ministry. And if you pay attention, that's when the plans to get rid of him kicked into high gear. Same exact pattern. Joseph was thrown into a pit as Yeshua was thrown into the ground. Joseph's life was spared and he was brought out. Our rabbis teach us for various reasons that it was after 3 days. And Yeshua was lifted out of the ground after 3 days. Joseph was sold to the Gentiles for the price of a slave. Yeshua was sold to the Gentiles for the price of a slave. And those are just some of the many, many crossovers there. Now Joseph, through his obedience and through his suffering and through his wisdom in interpreting dreams, eventually becomes the right hand of the king of the whole world, Pharaoh. Right? And what does he do with this power? He gathers up the grain during 7 good years in preparation for 7 years of famine. And during those 7 years of famine, he feeds the entire world bread. Yeshua, in a famine that Amos prophesied about, the prophet Amos talked about a day when there would be a famine not of bread, but of hearing the words of the Lord. Yeshua fed the bread of life to the entire world in the same way. Now Joseph's brothers come back after many years apart, and they come to Egypt because they hear there's bread there. And when they get there, they don't recognize Joseph. Why don't they recognize him? Well, we're told that he shaved his head in Egyptian style before he went in to see Pharaoh, and he certainly hadn't let it grow back out again. We're told that he was dressed in Egyptian regalia. He was dressed like an Egyptian. And he was speaking to them in Egyptian through an interpreter, so they wouldn't know that he could overhear their conversations. Now, why, for most of 2,000 years, have very few Jews even recognized Jesus to be Jewish? The answer is, we dressed him up as a Gentile. If you go look at Christian art, I'm going to pick on Christian art here because the art reflects the inner eye of the artist, right? Okay, do you see a guy with a long beard, dressed in robes that have these dangling from them? These are called tzitzit. These are actually commanded in Numbers chapter 15, so Yeshua would have worn them. Do you see him wearing a kippah or some kind of head covering, like a scarf would have been more common back then? Do you see him with the phylacteries, the little boxes? We call them tefillin, the prayer boxes? No. As a matter of fact, half the time he's blonde-haired and blue-eyed. Okay? He looks like a Gentile sage or king, not a Jew. So he's dressed up like a Gentile. He's got his hair cut in a Gentile style. He's got this nice, neatly trimmed beard. Now, I keep my beard neatly trimmed because my wife makes me. I would love to have the Gandalf beard going on, but she just won't let me get away with that. But Yeshua would have. His beard probably would have been down to here by the time he was 30. Okay? Because it was just the normal practice in his day, especially among rabbis. And have we kept his words in Hebrew? Now, Jerome, I have a lot of respect for Jerome. You know, he went and he lived in, they called it Palestine at the time, but Israel, for 10 years to learn Hebrew so that he could do a translation into the Latin, not from the Greek like everyone else was doing, but from the original Hebrew. And he had contact with monks that actually had a Hebrew original copy of the book of Matthew. But that's not been preserved for us unless we happen to go find it in a jug out in the desert someday. I hope we find the Dead Sea Matthew someday. But in the meantime, Yeshua's words were not kept in Hebrew, they were kept in Greek. And that means that he speaks to his brothers through an interpreter. I actually had the chance to be the interpreter when I was in Jerusalem a few years ago, and I was speaking to a teacher there who had a question about how to translate a certain passage in the New Testament. But of course, Joseph, after testing his brothers, and his test is he wants them to bring in Benjamin. Why? Because he wanted to see if they had done something to Benjamin while he was gone. And the brothers bring in Benjamin, and then he tests them further by putting his silver cup with Benjamin. Who is Benjamin in this story? Benjamin, I think, is the Messianic Jewish remnant. Paul tells us in Romans 11 that God always keeps a remnant of his people for himself. I'm going to make a little distinction here. Hopefully I won't offend anyone. There's a difference between a Messianic Jew and a Jewish Christian. Okay? Messianic Jew continues to practice and continues to live as a Jew. There are many Christians that have Jewish blood. I was at a Presbyterian church doing a Passover this last year, and their associate pastor, his mother was Jewish. And he tells me this, I'm like, well, you realize that makes you Jewish whether you like it or not. But he wasn't living as a Jew. He did not identify as a Jew. He's just like, my mom's Jewish, not I'm Jewish. I met another young man as I'm walking by. This young teenage guy stands up and is like, hey, is that a yarmulke? I'm like, yeah. He's like, awesome, my mom's Jewish. I said, well, then you're Jewish. He's like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. But you know, he didn't really feel Jewish. He had become fully Christian, okay? And I'm not saying that's all bad, but I think it's a little bit tragic for our people in some respects. I think that they're almost like, you remember how Simeon was taken away by Joseph? He puts him in prison as a hostage against them bringing Benjamin back. Well, Benjamin, I think, represents those Jews who never gave up either their Jewishness or their belief in Yeshua, and they're actually far more than most people realize today. And when he comes, Joseph feeds all the brothers, but he feeds Benjamin 5 times as much. He gives him extra gifts. And then he hides his silver cup in Benjamin's sack to test him. And when the brothers find that silver cup and they think Benjamin stole it, oh, there's weeping and gnashing of teeth and ripping of clothes. Well, today, a lot of Jews are being found with Yeshua's cup in their sack, so to speak. And it's coming out just how many Jews do believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. And it's actually causing some weeping and gnashing of teeth among my people. But as Benjamin is brought in, Simeon's brought out. And we're finding a lot of people who realize that, you know, hey, my mother was Jewish, my grandmother was Jewish, and they're starting to reconnect with that. So hallelujah. So what do we have in the story? We have several distinct people. Joseph is the picture of the Messiah. There's a reason why God made sure that Yeshua's earthly father was named Joseph. Because the rabbis believed in both a Mashiach, son of David, the conquering king, and a Mashiach ben Yosef, Messiah, son of Joseph, a suffering servant. And so God made sure that we wouldn't miss the point by making sure that Yeshua's stepfather was named Joseph. And so the son of Joseph is there, and he suffered, and yet he's feeding the entire Gentile world. Who's that? It's everyone here. But he also feeds his brothers against the day when they could be reconciled. And the ultimate thing that allows him to reveal himself to his brothers is when Benjamin comes forward. So you see, we've got like all three. We have the Messiah, we have the Gentiles, we have that believing Jewish remnant, and we have the majority who are not believing, who don't even recognize their brother yet. All there in that story.